The board doesn't reimburse unauthorized work. That's final. Ranatata Stovall, HOA president, eyes locked on mine, tone pure frost, zero remorse. Behind her, Cedar Lake sparkling under the afternoon sun. The same lake I just poured $28,500 into. 22 years grinding as an electrician, every dollar of it. To fix the main drainage pipe and keep flood water out of 23 houses, hers included. Rejection letter, 2 cold lines, cute little lake cartoon logo, her signature huge at the bottom. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, stood up, walked out without a single word. The next morning I made one phone call. By noon, every path to that lake was gone. Every dock, every boat slip, every inch of access, locked, legal, and permanent. They still don't know how I did it. You're staring across that table at Ranatata. What do you do? Drop, walk away, or hit back harder right now? The board doesn't reimburse unauthorized work. That's final. Ranatata Stovall, HOA president, eyes locked on mine, tone pure frost, zero remorse. Behind her, Cedar Lake sparkling under the afternoon sun. The same lake I just poured $28,500 into. 22 years grinding as an electrician, every dollar of it, to fix the main drainage pipe and keep flood water out of 23 houses, hers included. Rejection letter, 2 cold lines, cute little lake cartoon logo, her signature huge at the bottom. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, stood up, walked out without a single word. The next morning I made one phone call. By noon, every path to that lake was gone. Every dock, every boat, slip, every inch of access, locked, legal, and permanent. They still don't know how I did it. You're staring across that table at Renata. What do you do? Drop, walk away, or hit back harder right now? Comment your state below. Let's see how far this reaches. To understand how I ended up locking 23 families out of the lake they paid premium real estate prices to live on, you need to understand Kettle Cove. Kettle Cove is a small residential community about 40 miles outside of Nashville, Tennessee, the kind of place you drive past on a 2-lane county road and think, I wonder what those folks have going on in there. It's tucked behind a tree of old-growth oaks, the kind with bark so deep and rigged, it looks like something drew lines on it with a pocket knife. There are 24 homes, 24, and each of them backs up against a private lake, Cedar Lake. About 11 acres of cold green water that smells like pine resin and wet clay after a rain in summer. You can hear the frogs starting up around dusk, like a second heartbeat for the whole property. My name is Garrett Pulliam. I'm 51 years old. I spent 22 years doing electrical contracting before I got smart about money. And I bought my place at Kettle Cove in 2018 because my daughter Brianna spent every summer of her childhood at a lake camp, and I wanted to give her that feeling permanently. I'm not rich. I saved hard, got a fair deal on the property, and figured a community of 24 homes with a private lake association would be, nice, civil, grown up. Enter Rena Stovall. Renata is the kind of woman who treats Robert's Rules of Order like sacred scripture and brings a printed agenda to a pizza party. She'd been the Kettle Cove HOA board president for 6 years when I moved in. And in those 6 years she had fined 17 separate homeowners for unapproved aesthetic modifications, a category she appeared to be inventing in real time. One neighbor, a retired firefighter named Cobb Hensley, got a written warning because his garden hose was the wrong shade of green. I am not making that up, it was in the official meeting minutes. But here's what made Ranatata genuinely dangerous. Rather than just annoying. Her brother-in-law, Dale Penfield, owned the only landscaping and outdoor maintenance company the HOA would contract, and somehow every time a job came up, Dale's company got it at rates that made every contractor in the county squint and look at the ceiling. The HOA dues kept climbing. The quality of work kept dropping, and Renata kept smiling that particular smile of someone who believes the rules exist to protect them specifically. The first unfair act I personally witnessed was in the fall of 2021. A storm, nothing catastrophic, just a nasty line of squalls that came through in October, washed out the shared drainage culvert on the east side of the lake. This culvert is critical. It controls the water table for the lower properties, mine included. Without it functioning correctly, 3 homes flood in a heavy rain. The HOA's own governing documents, Section 4, subsection C, specifically list shared drainage infrastructure as a board-maintained common element, black and white. Renata called an emergency board meeting. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The board voted, Renata, her 2 hand-picked co-members, all in favor, to defer maintenance pending a full infrastructure audit. That audit was never commissioned. Meanwhile, the culvert sat there partially collapsed. One good rainstorm away from turning my garage into a swimming pool. I called Dale's company. I called 2 other contractors. I got 3 quotes. The range was $22,000 to $31,000 for proper repair. I documented everything. I sent certified letters to the board. I got back form letters polite, vague, and absolutely meaningless. 6 months later, in April of 2022, I hired a licensed civil contractor out of Murrysboro named Tuck Bram. Tuck had 30 years of experience, a reputation for honest work, and absolutely zero patience for bureaucratic nonsense. He fixed the culvert properly, did the channel, replaced the failed sections with reinforced concrete pipe, installed proper outflow protection. $28,500. I paid it out of my own pocket from savings from the same savings I'd spent 2 decades building. Then I submitted the reimbursement request to the HOA. The denial letter arrived 11 days after I submitted my reimbursement request. 11 days. I know people who've waited longer for a pizza. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph, acknowledged receipt of my submission. The second paragraph, acknowledged receipt of my submission. The second paragraph, and I'm going to read you the exact phrasing, because it is a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate nothing-speak, said that the board had reviewed the matter and determined that the repair, while potentially beneficial to the community, was undertaken without prior board authorization and therefore does not qualify for reimbursement under Section 7, Paragraph 2 of the Kettle Cove HOA Operating Agreement. Section 7, Paragraph 2, they cited that like a mic drop, so I pulled out my copy of the operating agreement, which I had already read because I'm that guy, and I looked up Section 7, Paragraph 2. It says, and I quote, "Reimbursement for unapproved expenditures shall not be issued for discretionary improvements, cosmetic upgrades, or owner preference modifications." It says nothing about emergency infrastructure repair, nothing about drainage, nothing about common elements maintained in Section 4. They didn't even cite the right clause. They pulled the closest thing to a denial that existed in the document and hoped I wouldn't notice. I noticed. Here's what I did next, and this is important. I didn't call Renata. I didn't send an angry email. I didn't post in the neighborhood Facebook group at midnight with 17 typos. Instead, I went to see my attorney. Her name is Phyllis Ostrander. Phyllis has been practicing HOA and property law in Middle Tennessee for 27 years and has the energy of someone who genuinely enjoys making HOA boards uncomfortable. She looked at my documents for about 8 minutes, flipped to Section 4, looked back at the denial letter, and made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, but somewhere in between that I can only describe as professional satisfaction. "They have a problem," she said. "Because Section 4 isn't ambiguous. Shared drainage is a board-maintained common element. They failed to maintain it. You repaired it. The legal doctrine you're looking at is called the necessary expenditure doctrine. When a property owner makes expenditures to protect shared property that a responsible party failed to maintain, recovery is available even without prior approval. Takeaway: the necessary expenditure doctrine means if an HOA fails to fix something they're legally required to fix, and you fix it instead, courts have repeatedly found that recovery is available, prior authorization or not. Search HOA Necessary Expenditure Reimbursement Case Law. Phyllis drafted a formal demand letter, not aggressive, precise. It cited Section 4, subsection C, referenced the necessary expenditure doctrine by name, attached my contractor invoices, my certified mail receipts, and a 1-page timeline showing 6 months of unreturned requests. We sent it certified mail, return receipt, and by email with read confirmation. The read confirmation came back at 7:43 in the morning. Now here's where Renata made her first real mistake. Instead of calling her own lawyer, she called a neighborhood meeting. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a squat little building with drop ceilings and folding chairs that smells permanently of old coffee and someone's grandmother's potpourri. Renata stood at the front with her printed agenda and her careful expression and said, I'm paraphrasing, but barely, that I had taken unauthorized action on community property, submitted an inflated invoice, and was now attempting to extract money from the community through legal intimidation. I want to give you a clear picture of that room. 11 neighbors and folding chairs, a projector screen nobody had turned on, and a coffee urn by the door that had clearly been burning the same pot since some time before I moved in. That specific scent of scorched Arabica that HOA meetings seemed to require by law. Renata had brought her own podium, a small wooden one with a little brass nameplate, Kettle Cove, HOA. She'd carried it from her car. That detail has stayed with me. I recognized the expression on most of the faces in that room. Not anger exactly, more like the careful attention of people who've been waiting for someone to say the obvious thing out loud. I had the documents, I had the clause, I had Phyllis's letter folded in my jacket pocket like a card I hadn't played yet. I let Renata run her part, watched her work the room with 6 years of practiced authority. She was good at it, but she'd made one critical error in calling this meeting. She'd given me a room. I was sitting in the 3rd row. I let her finish. Then I raised my hand, and I asked one question. Renata, can you point me to the section of the operating agreement that designates the drainage culvert as owner-maintained rather than board-maintained? She looked at her agenda. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she said the meeting was adjourned. After that meeting, Renata went quiet for about 3 weeks. In my experience, when someone like Renata goes quiet, they aren't surrendering. They're reloading. Sure enough, in early June, I got a notice in the mail, certified return receipt, because apparently she'd been watching, informing me that the HOA board had voted to temporarily suspend my dock access privileges, pending a review of my outstanding violations. Outstanding violations. I had never received a single violation notice in 4 years of living at Kettle Cove. Not one. The violations listed in the notice were failure to maintain vegetation within 6 in of the property line, fence, a rule that, as far as I could tell, had never been enforced against anyone, an alleged noise disturbance from a gathering in my backyard in September of 2021, which was my daughter's 15th birthday party, and my personal favorite, improper positioning of a personal watercraft. I don't own a personal watercraft. I have never owned a personal watercraft. I own a kayak. A kayak. A kayak. So, she was coming after my dock access. The dock I'd paid for on the lake I'd paid to live on, using violations she manufactured out of thin air, and one birthday party from 9 months ago. Here's what made this move interesting, though. It was actually useful information. Because to suspend dock access, Renata had to go on record about who controlled what in Kettle Cove. She had to articulate in a formal notice the authority structure, and in doing that, she gave me something I hadn't had before, a clear written record of the HOA asserting control over the lake access infrastructure. That mattered more than she realized because of the access road. See, here's a thing that most people in Kettle Cove had never looked at closely. The deed access to Cedar Lake, the actual legal path to the water, ran through a strip of land that was not owned by the HOA. It was not owned by any individual homeowner. It had been part of an original easement granted in 1987 when the development was first platted, an easement that was granted specifically to the original developer, a company called Kettle Cove Development LLC, to allow lake access during construction and establish community use. Kettle Cove Development LLC had dissolved in 1994. When a company that holds an easement dissolves, that easement doesn't automatically transfer to the HOA, depending on the state and how the dissolution was handled. It can simply lapse or sit in legal limbo or become a question that nobody wants answered because the answer is complicated. I found this by doing something embarrassingly simple. I went to the county recorder's office in Rutherford County and pulled the original plat. The document is public record. It took me 45 minutes and $8 in copying fees. The plat showed the easement, the dissolution record showed the company was gone, and there was no recorded transfer of that easement to the Kettle Cove HOA, not in 1994, not ever. Takeaway: easements don't automatically survive corporate dissolution. Search easement abandonment corporate dissolution state law plus your state. If a development company granted lake or road access easements and later dissolved, that access may be legally unprotected. County recorders' offices hold the original plat documents in our public record. I brought this to Phyllis. She did not make her professional satisfaction sound this time. She made a different sound, something more like, "Oh, this is going to be interesting." We now had 2 tracks running in parallel. Track 1 was my reimbursement claim supported by the necessary expenditure. Doctrine. Track 2 was a quiet, careful examination of who actually owned the legal right to use the lake access path and whether the HOA's entire authority over lake access was built on a foundation that had been quietly rotting since 1994. I want to be clear, I didn't go looking for the second track to be destructive. I went looking because Renata suspended my dock access. She drew first, she just didn't check what she was drawing on. Here's a practical note worth pausing on because it applies to anyone in a dispute with an HOA or any property-controlling entity. The most powerful documents in FIST. The most powerful documents in the FIST. SA situations are almost never secret. They're sitting in a county recorder's office, a probate, court filing, or a tax assessor's database waiting for someone to spend 45 minutes and ask for them. Most people never do. Most people assume the entity they're fighting has done its homework. Renata had never checked the easement because nobody had ever made her. 6 years, 24 homeowners, not one of them had walked into that county office and pulled the original plat. I wasn't smarter than anyone. I was just angrier, and I had 45 minutes. By late July, word was getting around. Not from me. I'd kept quiet, which in a 24-home community is roughly as conspicuous as being very loud. The silence was its own signal. My neighbor across the cul-de-sac, a retired surveyor named Warren Fitch, knocked on my door one evening around 7. Warren is the kind of man who has a specific tool for every specific task and knows where every single one of them is. Paul had been in Kettle Cove for 11 years and had his own complicated history with Renata involving a fence dispute that had consumed 6 months of his life and approximately 4 in of his property line. He came in, sat at my kitchen table, declined coffee and said, "You found the easement thing, didn't you?" I looked at him for a second. "How do you know about that?" "Because I'm a surveyor, Garrett. I've known about it for 6 years. I just didn't know what to do with it. Warren was the first ally. He wasn't the last." Over the next 2 weeks, I had quiet conversations with 7 other homeowners. Not a campaign, not a petition. Just conversations, over fences, in driveways. On a Tuesday evening when Cobb Hensley, the retired firefighter with the wrong-colored garden hose, invited a few of us over for his wife Della's pulled pork, which he makes with a dry rub that is frankly world-class and fills the whole deck with the smell of brown sugar and de-smoked paprika. These were people who'd been quietly furious for years. They just needed someone who was willing to do the paperwork. Meanwhile, Renata escalated again. She sent a second notice, this one to every homeowner, not just me, announcing a special assessment for unanticipated community infrastructure costs. The assessment, $1,200 per household, due within 60 days. That's $28,800 total. 23 households, $1,200 each. You see what she did there? She was trying to have the community pay back the board for a cost she was claiming the board hadn't authorized. The math was identical to my reimbursement request, within $300, and the irony was so thick you could cut it with a surveying instrument. Cobb nearly spit out his sweet tea when he read the notice. She's charging us for the thing you already fixed, the thing she refused to pay you for. Essentially, yes. Here's where it gets legally interesting and worth paying close attention to. Tennessee's HOA statutes, specifically Tennessee Code Annotated Section 66275,004, require that special assessments above a certain threshold be approved by a homeowner vote, not just a board vote. Renata's board had approved this internally. No homeowner vote. Number 30. Day notice. No nothing. Takeaway. Most states have HOA statutes requiring homeowner votes for special assessments above a set threshold. Tennessee requires this under TCAC 6275004. Search your state HOA special assessment homeowner approval requirements. If your board skipped this step, the assessment may be legally invalid. I filed a formal objection to the special assessment within 48 hours. 7 of my neighbors joined the objection within a week. Phyllis filed it with the county and copied the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOA compliance in the state. Renata's response to the objection was to call another board meeting attended only by her 3-person board, no homeowners invited, and vote to uphold the assessment. She then sent a second notice, this one with a 10% late fee already attached, as if 60 days hadn't passed yet. The late fee was applied before the due date. She had added a penalty before the bill was even due. It was the move of someone who had never been seriously checked in 6 years and didn't understand what that meant about her current situation. I went home that night, poured myself a glass of very adequate bourbon, sat on my back deck, and listened to the frogs on Cedar Lake starting up in the dark. Somewhere out on the water, something splashed. A bass probably, or one of the heron that nests on the east bank. The lake didn't care about any of this. The lake just kept doing what it had always done. I had one more card to play before the real move, and it was a good one. I also want to note something about the coalition at this point, because I think it's the part of this story people underestimate. Building it wasn't dramatic. It was conversations. It was showing up at Cobb's deck with nothing to offer except honesty and documentation. It was asking people what had happened to them and actually listening. Warren had lost 4 in a property line. Cobb had the garden hose citation framed on his garage wall. I am not making that up. He'd had it framed. The Stottlemyres had a fence dispute that had never been resolved. Every single person had a version of the same story. A petty rule applied selectively, a complaint ignored, a fee that appeared without explanation. What I gave them wasn't a plan. It was permission to stop accepting it. 3 weeks before I made my main move, Phyllis called me at 8 o'clock in the morning. She had that tone, not the professional satisfaction sound, but the quieter one she uses when something has landed cleanly, and she wants to walk through it carefully. I've been going through. The HOA's financials, she said. The ones they're required to disclose under Tennessee law. Have you looked at them? I had not. I hadn't known I could access them. Under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 6.6.27.5002, HOA members have the legal right to inspect the association's financial records, including budgets, bank statements, and contracts. Most states have equivalent provisions. Search your state HOA financial records, homeowner inspection rights. Phyllis had requested them on my behalf. The HOA was required to provide them within 10 business days. They took 14, which was already a violation. And what they sent was incomplete. No bank statements, no contract documentation for the past 3 years. Just a summarized budget spreadsheet that looked like it had been assembled in about 20 minutes by someone who was nervous. That nervousness turned out to be warranted. Here's what Phyllis found working from the partial documents, plus the county contractor licensing database, which is also public record. Dale Pinfield's company, the brother-in-law's landscaping operation, had been paid by the Kettle Cove HOA for $67,000 in services over the previous 3 years. $67,000 for a community of 24 homes. For comparison, the HOA's entire annual operating budget, the number on the disclosure form, was listed at $31,000 a year. Dale's company had collected more than 2 years of the association's stated budget in 3 years of contracts. And here's the part that Phyllis said very carefully, because she is a precise person. I can't prove fraud without a full audit, but I can tell you that what we're looking at is a pattern that a judge would find interesting, and I can tell you that board members of an HOA in Tennessee have a fiduciary duty to the community. The same kind of duty that gets people in serious trouble when they breach it. She recommended we file a formal request for a FA, all financial audit, citing the incomplete disclosure and the apparent discrepancy. We also filed a complaint with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission, not just about the special assessment anymore, but about the disclosure failures and the pattern of contract awards. Renata was no longer managing a noisy neighbor with a repair bill. She was now managing a formal complaint with a state oversight body, a pending legal challenge to her special assessment, and a disclosure request she'd partially stonewalled. The ground had shifted. She just hadn't felt it move yet. I'd spent 4 months being patient, building the case, documenting everything, taking the certified mail receipts, and filing them in a folder with tabs. Now it was time to use the easement. But first, a small moment I don't want to skip over. The night Phyllis called with the financial numbers, I sat on my back deck for a long time after we hung up. The lake was doing its usual thing: frogs, ripples, the occasional heron silhouette moving slow and deliberate across the far bank. $1,000 in questionable contracts, $28,500 in legitimate repairs. They refused to cover. I did the math in my head while the crickets ran their evening shift. Rana hadn't just denied my claim. She'd been running a private revenue stream through this community for 3 years and dressing it up as governance. That's a different kind of problem, and it required a different kind of answer. Here's how you lock 23 families out of their lake access legally, permanently, and in a way that a court will not undo. Step 1. Establish ownership of the access corridor. The strip of land that the 1987 easement ran through, the physical path between the houses and the lake, was approximately 40 feet wide and about 600 feet long. The easement had been granted by the original developer. The original developer had dissolved. There was no recorded transfer due. To who owned the underlying land? Warren Fitch knew because Warren had surveyed it quietly years ago, just out of professional curiosity. The land itself, not the easement, but the actual dirt, was titled to a family trust, established by the development company's original owner, a man named Reginald Alstrom, who had passed away in 2008. The trust had passed to his daughter, Pet Alstrom Greer, who now lived in Chattanooga and had inherited a strip of land she didn't know she had, and had never paid much attention to. Phyllis found her in about 3 days. Property records, probate filings, a forwarding address from the county tax assessor's office. She'd been paying a small annual property tax on the strip, probably without knowing what it was for, because the bills were small and the property description was abstract. Phyllis called her, explained the situation. Pet Alstrom Greer, who turned out to be a retired school principal with an extremely dry sense of humor, listened to the whole story and then said, So, you're telling me I own the path to a private lake and an HOA has been acting like they own it for 30 years? Phyllis confirmed that was essentially accurate. How much is it worth? Pled asked. This is where the chess move came together, because the answer was a lot. If you own the only legal access to an 11-acre private lake with 24 homes depending on it, and the easement that previously allowed that access has lapsed, then you own something extremely valuable. Lawyers call this a landlocked parcel situation. The lake-adjacent properties technically have no guaranteed legal right-of-way to their lake. Takeaway: if a development's access easement has lapsed due to corporate dissolution and was never re-recorded, the underlying landowner controls access, and affected property owners may have no legal right-of-way. Search landlocked parcel access easement, lapse for HOA. What courts have handled this? We negotiated with Pet not to buy the land outright, but to enter into a formal access agreement, a real one, a recorded one that gave the homeowners access, established clear terms, and could be revoked if those terms were violated. The terms were simple. Pet would grant an access easement to a newly formed homeowner association. Not Renata's board-controlled HOA, but a new entity, a proper one with democratic bylaws, mandatory financial disclosure, and a prohibition on self-dealing contracts. The new association would also make an annual contribution of $5,000 to the Cedar Lake Conservation Fund, a simple account Phyllis helped us establish for water quality monitoring and shoreline maintenance. Something concrete and real for the lake that all of us actually loved. The old HOA, Renata's HOA, would not be a party to this agreement. It would have no standing to grant or control access. None. While all this was being structured, I did the physical part, because this whole story has to have a physical part. I am at my core a guy who spent 2 decades doing electrical contracting, and I believe in things you can see and touch. The access path crossed a small wooden bridge over a drainage ditch, the same drainage ditch I had repaired, which gave me a particular sense of symmetry. The bridge itself was on Plett's property. With her written permission, documented, notarized, I installed a steel security gate at the bridge, heavy gauge, keyed lock. I did it myself, on a Tuesday morning, gravel crunching under my work boots. the smell of cut grass from the properties on either side, and the particular satisfaction of a man who was completing an arc. The gate took 2 hours to install. It worked perfectly. Every homeowner who joined the new association got a key. Everyone else's access depended on an HOA, whose legal authority to grant that access. Stowe Road no longer existed. Renata's HOA was now an organization that couldn't deliver the one thing it had been selling for 30 years. The gate went up on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Renata knew. The first call came from a board member named Sandra Willite, who was the least culpable of the three. She'd mostly gone along with Renata because she liked having a seat at the table and hadn't looked too carefully at what the table was for. Sand called me, voice tight, and said, "Garrett, what did you do?" "I installed a gate," I said. "With the permission of the property owner, you're welcome to review the notarized authorization." There was a long pause. The property owner of the land the path crosses. Yes, another pause. I could almost hear her doing the math. "I think I need to make some calls," Sandra said. Renata's response was not as measured. She retained an attorney, a man named Puit Garvey, who ran a general practice in Smyrna and whose main experience with HOA law appeared to be reading about it. Garvey sent Phyllis a letter claiming the gate was an unlawful interference with established community access and demanding its immediate removal, citing decades of continuous use as the basis for an implied easement by prescription. Prescriptive easements are real. They can apply when someone uses land openly, continuously, and without permission for a statutory period. Tennessee's statutory period is 7 years. This is genuinely a legal theory that could have applied if the use had been without permission, but the 1987 easement, even if lapsed, meant the original use was permitted, not adverse. You can't have a prescriptive easement on land you had an express right to use. The permission breaks the prescription. Takeaway. Prescriptive easements require continuous adverse use, meaning use without permission. If you had an express easement that lapsed, courts generally hold you and claim prescription because the original use was permitted. Search prescriptive easement adverse use permission exception. Phyllis responded to Garvey's letter in 4 paragraphs. The 4th paragraph noted that the HOA had publicly acknowledged in its most recent community notice that lake access was within the board's authority, which meant the board was implicitly acknowledging that access was something they controlled and could lose. The letter concluded by noting that the new homeowner association had already been formed and recorded, and that 17 of the 24 households had already signed up. 17. That was the number that hit Renata like a door. She tried a smear campaign next. She sent a letter, ostensibly from the board, though we later learned only she had signed it, to every homeowner accusing me of secretly acquiring property rights and staging a hostile takeover of community assets. She used the phrase hostile takeover in a letter about a residential lake community in Tennessee. I genuinely respected the drama of it. She also went to see 2 of the homeowners who hadn't yet joined the new association, including an elderly couple named the Stottlemeyers, who had lived in Kettle Cove for 22 years and were deeply uncomfortable with conflict of any kind. She told them the new association was legally questionable and that joining it might jeopardize their property rights. Mr. starred in with Stottlemeyer, who was 74 and had done 30 years in industrial insurance and could smell a misrepresentation from 40 yards, called me that evening. "She came to our house, Garrett," he said in person. "Told Esther the new group might take our dock away." "That's not accurate," I said. "Do you want to see the agreement?" The Stottlemeyers joined the new association the next morning. They were numbers 19 and 20. The smear campaign had one unintended side effect. It accelerated recruitment. Every letter Anata sent, every neighbor she visited with warnings about legal questions and hostile takeovers, pushed people to read the actual documents. And when people read the actual documents, the new association's bylaws, the access agreement with PET, the prohibition on self-dealing contracts, the contrast was self-evident. One document was a power structure. The other was a set of rules that applied equally to everyone. Number 21 was a man named Dex Whitmore, who had been at Kettle Cove for only 18 months and had spent most of that time trying to stay neutral in what he described as whatever this whole situation is. Dex was 44, ran a flooring business out of Murfreesboro. and had the pragmatic outlook of someone who spent his days measuring rooms and making things fit. He read the access agreement in about 12 minutes, looked up and said, "So the old HOA literally cannot give me lake access anymore." I confirmed that was accurate. He signed the application on the spot. "I just want to use my dock," he said. "That's all I ever wanted. That was all any of us had ever wanted." With 19 households in and 5 still on the fence, Renata made what I can only describe as a tactically catastrophic decision. She went to the county. Specifically, she filed a complaint with the Rutherford County Building and Codes Office claiming my gate installation was an unpermitted structure and requesting an emergency inspection. She also made a call. She told at least 2 neighbors about this to a friend she had on the County Planning Commission, asking whether the new association could be reviewed for compliance issues. Now, I want to explain something about what happens when someone who has been filing complaints, making calls, and throwing procedural weight around for years suddenly makes those moves in a situation where every document is in order. The building codes inspector came out. His name, was Terrence, and he had the look of a man who had seen every variety of neighbor dispute in his career and had developed a resting expression of careful neutrality as a result. He looked at the gate. He looked at the notarized authorization from Pet Olstrom Greer. He looked at the gate again. He said, "This is permitted as an agricultural gate on private property." He left. The Planning Commission inquiry went nowhere. The new association's formation documents were clean. Phyllis had made sure of that, and a residential homeowner association is not the kind of thing a planning commission reviews for compliance. But the county visit had one unintended consequence Ranatada hadn't anticipated. When the inspector came out, he noticed in the course of looking around that the shared dock on the HOA's common property showed signs of deferred maintenance, specifically 2 sections of decking that appeared to be below the load-bearing standards required by county code. He noted it in his inspection report. That report was public record. The Tennessee Real Estate Commission, which was still reviewing our financial complaint, received a copy automatically because that's how coordinated government record sharing works. Renata had called in a codes inspector to investigate my gate, and the inspector had written up her doc. I will be honest with you, there was a moment sometime around the 3rd week of September when I almost felt something close to pity for Renata. Not forgiveness, not even close, but a kind of sad recognition that every move she made was digging the hole deeper. She was clearly operating from a playbook that had worked for 6 years, throw procedural weight and bureaucratic friction at problems until they go away. The problem was that I had spent 4 months building a structure specifically designed to be immune to procedural friction. Every document was filed, every authorization was notarized, every step had been taken in the right order by the right people. She was pushing against a wall that had been specifically engineered to not move. The formal petition to remove her from the board came the same week, signed by 11 households, delivered certified mail return receipt. I kept the green card in the same folder with every other document in this whole story. That folder is about 1.5 inches thick now. Sometimes I look at it and think about how none of this should have been necessary. A phone call, a contractor invoice, a clause, and a document she'd agreed to uphold. That's all it would have taken. The investigation into the HOA's finances was quietly expanding. Phyllis had submitted a second document request, this one more specific. She wanted the actual bank statements, the actual contracts with Dale Pinfield's company, and the minutes from all executive sessions for the prior 3 years. The HOA had 10 business days to comply. They took 23. When the documents arrived, they were more complete than the first submission, but they told a story. Over 3 years, Dale's landscaping company had been paid for services including seasonal site management, drainage monitoring, and aesthetic upkeep. The drainage monitoring line item was particularly charged, given that drainage had been the one thing that hadn't been monitored or maintained. Ranatada was also facing a personal problem. Her 2 board co-members, Sandre Wilhite and a man named Bert Kavanagh, had both quietly retained their own attorneys by mid-September. Board members in an HOA share fiduciary liability. They had just started to understand what that meant. Sandre resigned from the board on a Wednesday. Bert followed on Friday. Ranatada was now the sole officer of an HOA, with no functioning board, a state investigation underway, a financial audit request outstanding, a security gate she couldn't remove, and 20 of 24 homeowners in a competing association with actual legal access to the lake. On a cool Saturday morning in early October, I was out on my deck with coffee when Warren Fitch came around the side of the house with 2 mugs and sat in the other chair without asking. The lake was absolutely still. The oaks around the east bank had started turning, that deep rust and gold that Middle Tennessee does about as well as anywhere in the country. There was wood smoke from somewhere down the road. "You think she knows it's over?" Warren asked. I drank my coffee. "She'll know. Thursday," I said. Thursday was the annual Kettle Cove community meeting. The fall one held every October in the clubhouse. The one where dues and the next year's budget get ratified. Renata had called it before everything fell apart, back when she thought she was still in control of the calendar. She couldn't cancel it without a formal board vote, and she no longer had a board. So, the meeting happened. 22 of the 24 homeowners showed up. That's more than had attended any community meeting in the prior 6 years combined, according to Warren, who had been keeping attendance notes out of personal habit since 2017. They filed into the folding chairs. The room smelled of old coffee and someone's candle, and the drop ceiling tiles were a little more brown around the edges than I remembered. Renata was already at the front when the rest of us arrived. She had her printed agenda. She had her careful expression, but she was alone at the table. No co-board members because there were no co-board members anymore. The meeting had barely been called to order when Phyllis Ostrander walked in. Phyllis is not a dramatic woman by nature. She's methodical. She's precise. She dresses like she's about to give a deposition, which she often is. She took a seat in the back and put her brief case on the floor. 2 minutes later, a man in a navy jacket with a badge wallet came in and took a seat near the door. He was with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission. His name was Agent Vickers, and he was there as an observer, which is a technical designation that means watching for any additional evidence of the thing we were already investigating. Renata saw him. Her careful expression did something complicated. I let her call the meeting to order. I let her get through the first 2 agenda items: approval of prior minutes, treasurer's report, normal stuff. The treasurer's report was particularly interesting, given what we now knew about the finances, but I let it go. Then, under new business, I stood up. I had 1 page of notes. I didn't really need them. I laid out calmly in sequence the following: the drainage failure and the 6 months of unanswered requests, the $28,500 repair, the denial citing the wrong clause, Renata's improper special assessment, which violated Tennessee statute, the lapsed easement and the gate, the new homeowner association which now had 20 of 24 households, the financial disclosure failures, and the pending state investigation. Then I read slowly from the HOA's own governing documents. Section 4, subsection C, Shared Drainage Infrastructure Board maintained common element. The room was completely quiet. Renata said, "You don't have the floor." "Actually," Phyllis said from the back of the room in the tone of someone who has been waiting to say 3 words for 4 months, "he does. Under Tennessee Code, any member may raise matters of financial impropriety at an annual meeting. Section 6, 27510. I can provide copies." Agent Vickers wrote something in a notebook. I want to describe the room at that moment, because I think about it still. 22 people in folding chairs, the same drop ceiling, the same coffee urn, the same faint smell of burnt Arabica and carpet. But the energy was completely different from any meeting this room had held in 6 years. Nobody was looking at their phones. Nobody was glancing at the door. They were all watching Renata, and Renata was watching Phyllis, and Phyllis was watching me with the particular calm of someone who has every relevant statute memorized and is not in a hurry. Renata's printed agenda was on the table in front of her, and for the first time in 6 years, it was completely useless. I then introduced the motion seconded immediately by Warren Fitch and Cobb Hensley, and 4 others to dissolve the current HOA board, call for new elections within 30 days, and commission an independent financial audit. The motion required a majority of present homeowners. We had 19 votes before I finished reading it aloud. Renata said, "This is a hostile takeover." "No," said Esther Stottlemyre, 71 years old, who had lived in Kettle Cove since before Renata moved in, and who I had never once heard raise her voice in 4 years of neighborhood life. "This is a vote. Those are different things." The motion passed 21 to 1. Renata gathered her printed agenda. She put her pen in her bag. She walked out of the clubhouse across the gravel parking lot. You could hear her footsteps, that precise crunch in the silence, and got into her car. We watched from the windows. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cobb Hensley said, "I'm going to go get my garden hose." And the room laughed, and it was the best sound I'd heard in 2 years. Here's what happened after. The independent financial audit confirmed what the incomplete disclosures had suggested. Over 3 years, Dale Pinfield's landscaping company had been paid for services that were either inflated, duplicated, or in 3 cases, simply not performed. The total discrepancy identified was $41,000. The Tennessee Real Estate Commission investigation resulted in formal findings against Renata Stovall for breach of fiduciary duty and failure to comply with financial disclosure requirements under state law. She was barred from serving as an HOA officer in Tennessee for 5 years. The board was dissolved and reconstituted in Democratic elections held 6 weeks after the clubhouse meeting. My reimbursement of $28,500 was approved by the new board at their first meeting. It passed unanimously in about 4 minutes, which is, I think, the exact amount of time that decision should have always taken. The new Kettle Cove Homeowners Association was formally chartered with bylaws written by Phyllis and reviewed by all 24 households. The bylaws include mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts above $2,000, annual independent financial review, and a conflict of interest policy that explicitly prohibits contracts with entities related to board members. These are things that should have existed from the beginning. They exist now. Peta Olstrom Greer, the retired school principal in Chattanooga, who turned out to own the lake access corridor, attended the first meeting of the new association by video call. She said she was glad it worked out, that she'd never really understood what that strip of land was, and that she was happy to have the access agreement properly recorded. She also said, with the dry tone of a woman who spent 30 years managing middle schoolers, that this was by far the most interesting property she'd ever owned. We sent her a fruit basket. It felt insufficient. We also added her name to the new association's letterhead as a founding access partner, which she seemed to find genuinely amusing. The Cedar Lake Conservation Fund, the $5,000 annual contribution written into the access agreement, started its first year with a water quality survey of the lake. The survey was conducted by a graduate student from Middle Tennessee State University who found the lake in good shape, but identified 2 spots on the north bank where runoff was introducing sediment. We fixed those. We also used part of the fund to establish the Cedar Lake Youth Stewardship Award, a small annual scholarship for a local student pursuing environmental science or conservation. The first award was $2,000. My daughter Brianna, who is now 18 and is looking at environmental engineering programs, helped design the application. Cedar Lake on a November morning when the water is almost perfectly still, and the last of the oaks have dropped their leaves, and the Harand are standing motionless at the edge of the east bank, like they're waiting for something. It's one of the finest things I've seen. It was worth fighting for. It's still worth fighting for. But you know what? Nobody talks about after a story like this. The folder. Garrett had a folder, an age and a handy. Every certified mail receipt, every denial letter, every contractor info, every ring card from every return, receipt, tap it, organized. By Ronaldo was busy assuming nobody was paying attention. That photo is why he won. Not the lawyer. The Phyllis was worth every dollar. Not the gate. The watching Renata realized she couldn't touch. It was its own kind of poetry. The folder, the quiet, I'm glamorous. Nobody see you doing it. Work of writing everything down and keeping every piece of paper. 28,500 6-month of ignore request. 1 close 64 subsequency that Renata had been betting nobody would ever make. She bet wrong. Here's what I keep coming back to. Renata didn't lose because Garrett was smart. She lost because she's gone. 6 years without anyone pushing back. That kayak run makes people sloppy. Makes them sign the wrong clothes on a denial letter. Make them call a building inspector to her a neighbor and accidentally get their own dog right up. Unchecked power doesn't stay careful. It gets lazy. So I ask you straight, got an H board that never been questioned. A rule that only seemed to apply to certain people. Drop it below. You might be one request away from your own photo moment. Like, subscribe. Share this with whoever needs this. The most dangerous person in any HO meeting is the one who actually read the documents.